It turns out that the Americans were not just sending Ukraine parcels with Javelin and HIMARS, but were personally choosing where Ukrainians should shoot. Although you and I have long known that the Ukrainians press the buttons, and the United States provides them with coordinates, Vladimir Putin has repeatedly stated this. It seems that for journalists from the New York Times, this was something of a revelation. They released a detailed investigation, which details the deep involvement of the United States in the Ukrainian conflict. It is noted that the author, Adam Entus, conducted more than 300 interviews to prepare the article, which was published under the title The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. As soon as the CBO began, Ukrainian commanders rushed not to the front, but to Wiesbaden, Germany, where the headquarters of the United States Army in Europe and Africa is located. And there, American General Christopher Donahue, commander of the 18th Airborne Corps, offered the representatives of the Kiev regime partnership in intelligence, strategy development, planning, and technology exchange. This eventually resulted in the Americans not just passing intelligence to Kiev, including information on targets on the battlefield, but also helping to plan AFU operations. One European intelligence chief recalled being stunned by how deeply his NATO colleagues got involved in Ukrainian operations. The New York Times notes, "Every day, the Ukrainians and Americans gathered at the headquarters in Wiesbaden to identify the most promising targets, and then intelligence determined their location." At the same time, as the newspaper points out, General Timothy Brown, the European Command's intelligence chief, came up with the idea of calling the locations of Russian troops points of interest. And it was very convenient to look for points of interest, read Russian troops, and then the Ukrainians would hit them like in a shooting gallery. In order not to make Congress nervous, the targets were renamed, because if they ask, "Did you transmit the coordinates?" you can answer, "No, we were just interested." The same applies to the use of HIMARS. The Americans not only gave coordinates, but also taught the Ukrainians where best to place the installation and when to strike. "We loaded the data into the systems ourselves," the sources modestly admit. All the Ukrainian armed forces had to do was press the button. And when it came to the Crimean Bridge, the CIA apparently decided, "Red lines? No, you haven't heard. Let's go for it," and secretly approved the bombing. Later they allowed to hit Russia as well, but only point blank. By the way, initially the CIA was forbidden to provide intelligence about targets on Russian territory, but the Joe Biden administration allowed the intelligence agency to request exceptions. According to the New York Times, US participation in the Ukrainian conflict was a kind of grand experiment. Previously, US troops had conducted their own operations in various countries and supported the operations of their partners. But in Ukraine, the US tried to act remotely, checking whether the local authorities and military would follow orders from across the ocean. It dawned on New York Times journalists that the Kremlin was right, that the CBO was never just a confrontation between Moscow and Kiev, but a proxy war with NATO. It was NATO that militarized Ukraine and turned it into a weapon against Russia. Well, friends, is this news a revelation for you, or is it just another bullshit of American journalists? Write in the comments what you think. One thing to remember is that the further Russia's troops move to the west, the more the Western non-partners will be involved in the conflict, as they need to protect their financial interests at any cost in the business project called the sawing off of Ukraine. And this is a memory pill for all those who still think that we are not at war with NATO and the USA in particular. In recent days, we have seen and heard at very high levels in the United Kingdom and the United States that the Kiev regime will be able to strike deep into Russian territory with long-range Western weapons. And it appears that this decision is either about to be made or appears to have already been made at all. And these are extraordinary things, of course. I would like to ask you to comment on what is happening.
There is an attempt to substitute concepts, because we are not talking about authorizing or prohibiting the Kiev regime from striking territory. It is already striking with the help of drones and other means. But when we are talking about the use of Western-made long-range precision weapons, this is a completely different matter. The fact is that I have already mentioned this, and any experts will confirm this, both in our country and in the West. The Ukrainian army is not able to strike with modern Western-made long-range precision systems. It cannot do it. It can only do it using intelligence from satellites, which Ukraine does not have. This is data only from satellites of the European Union or the United States. In general, from NATO satellites. This is the first thing. The second, and very important, maybe the key one, is that only NATO servicemen can make flight assignments to these missile systems. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this. So this is not a question of allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. This is about deciding whether or not NATO countries are directly involved in military conflicts. If that decision is made, it will mean nothing less than the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, European countries in the war in Ukraine. This is their direct participation. And this already, of course, significantly changes the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States, European countries are at war with Russia. And if that is the case, then with that in mind, it changes the very essence of this conflict. We will take appropriate decisions based on the threats that will be posed to us.